We have got Thair Abu-Ras here today talking about the Palestinians of Israel, the historical development from 1948 to present. This is a group of Palestinians that are often forgotten or neglected in the debate. So we're really, really happy to highlight it and to discuss this today. So I'm going to hand over to you and I will pop back later for the Q&A. So over to you.
All right, thank you, Diana. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning from Washington, D.C., which is where I'm talking to you. Good afternoon if you're in the UK or anywhere else around the world. It's a great honor to be with all of you today. It's great to be with the Balfour Project. I found out that I actually have a lot of acquaintances and friends who are members of the Balfour Project or are involved in one way or another. A special shout out to my former boss, my favorite boss, Bob Niven, who is also a member of the Balfour Project. I have also worked with many other people who are affiliated with one way or another with the project. So it's good to be with you, and I'm very happy that I get this opportunity to discuss an issue that is obviously one of those issues that is that always interests many people, but because of the salience of other events relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we don't usually get to talk about it a lot, and that is the Palestinian community inside Israel. Since we don't have a lot of time, and I want to give more time to the Q&A, I will begin. I will focus on some of the main points, and then hopefully we can go on from there. Diana, if you want to give me 5 minutes before we're done, just a reminder that I have 5 minutes left, that would be great. So let us begin. So before we dive in and talk about who the Palestinian citizens of Israel are, maybe it's just worth some general data to begin with, and then we can go in, especially with what's going on now with the war in Gaza, a war that has, in my opinion, developed into a genocide, and we can talk about that later. With this war going on in Gaza, obviously people tend to overlook other issues. But the question of the Palestinian citizens of Israel has been a major issue that has always been out there, and actually in the last few years has received a lot of traction, especially with a Palestinian party joining the Israeli government back in 2021, joining a governing coalition. So let's cover all of that, but first let's just begin with some of the most basic demographics about this community. So we're talking roughly about 1/5 of Israel's population are Palestinians, are of Palestinian descent. The exact number is also can also show someone's political bias, because some people would add citizens or residents of East Jerusalem, Palestinians from East Jerusalem, and Syrians in the Golan Heights to Israel's Palestinian population, and then all of a sudden it's 21%. But the real percentage of Palestinians who have an Israeli citizenship are about 18% of Israel's population at large. The majority of this community lives in northern Israel. So if you look at the map, all the places in green is where these are Arab majority towns and areas, basically. Sizable communities also live in central Israel and southern Israel, where you have the Bedouin Palestinian Arabs, which is a semi-nomadic community, and roughly 10%, maybe a little bit less of the community live in what we call mixed cities, which are cities with a Jewish majority, but a significant Arab minority, largely on the Mediterranean coast, cities like Acre, Haifa, Jaffa, Lid, and Ramli, even though they're not exactly on the coast, but very close to it. The vast majority of this community are Muslims, but there are significant minorities, Christians, and Jews. So that's just a little bit of, some macro data. So now let's just kind of, jump in a little bit to talk a little bit about this community. So first of all, who are the Palestinian citizens of Israel? We are basically the descendants of the Palestinian people that remained in their homes. The key word here is remained in their homes during the 1948. And following the ceasefire agreement, we basically fell under Israeli jurisdiction. So for those of you that know a little bit about the 1948 war, roughly 750,000 Palestinians during the war were ethnically cleansed. They were kicked out of their homes, or they fled the hostilities, but were not allowed to return to their homes once the hostilities ended. So they were basically ethnically cleansed and became refugees. And most people know the story of those 750,000 Palestinians. Not many people know the story of roughly 150,000 other Palestinians who we call today the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Now, as part of the UN partition plan of 1947, Israel was obliged to give citizenship to every single Palestinian that remained in her territory following the partition. So it wasn't out of Israel's goodwill. It was a demand by the international community at the time in 1948 that said, hey, you want us to recognize you as an independent country, you must extend citizenship to all your citizens and not only your Jewish citizens. And that's how they became Israeli citizens. So we're talking about a community that ethnically they are Arab, or from a nationality perspective, they are Palestinians, Palestinian Arabs. But from a citizenship perspective, they are Israelis. Okay, so this is something that might sound odd, but a person can both be a Palestinian and an Israeli at the same time. And this is what really makes this community a very interesting community. This whole notion of being a part of two communities or two identities that are at war with each other is something that we're not really used to in the modern world. You know, the whole Westphalian nation state was created to kind of overcome these kinds of issues. And in most places around the world, you won't find you won't find an example such as that of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. You know, one thing that comes to mind maybe is the Muslim minority in India or Hindus in Pakistan, but even Armenians in Azerbaijan. There are some examples out there, but there is no example of what we call an uncontractable conflict in political science, a conflict that is unable to be resolved, in which there is a community that is connected to both identities of that conflict. That is something that almost does not exist in the modern world today. And it's within this complexity, or what I would call identity crises, it's within this identity crisis that you are able to understand or try to understand the Palestinian community in Israel and how they behave politically. Now, I'm in the midst of writing my dissertation. Hopefully, I'll be done in February next year. And I'm asking people, Palestinian citizens of Israel, questions largely about identity. One of the questions that I ask them about identity is how you define yourself. And you can see here from the table that how the community largely defines itself. What is its priority identity-wise? Which identity of their multiple identities they prioritize first? And you can see that the Arab and Palestinian and religious identity are the main identities, but especially the Arab identity is the strongest identity the community affiliates with, and the Israeli identity is the weakest. But if you look at it from a religious perspective, which is table 2, you'll see that there is actually there's a variety, there's variation basically in responses based on sect. So for example, the Druze community has almost zero affiliation with the Palestinian identity, while for Muslims and Christians, it's a little bit different, and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to get to here is that we're talking about a community with multiple identity crises, multiple identity complexities. And in order to understand how this community behaves politically, it is important to understand this identity crisis. Now, where does this identity crisis stem from? Well, it stems from our lived experience in the state of Israel. It is the last 75 years of events and confrontations that we as a community have had to deal with that have shaped these identity crises. And when we talk about the historical development of the Palestinian community in Israel, there's this salient book that was published in the early 2000s by Dan Rabinovitz and Dalia Abu-Bakr, two prominent academics, that spoke about the historical development of the Palestinians in Israel. The name of the book in Hebrew is Thair Abu-Ras. I can't think of a good translation in English at the moment, but it's the steadfast generation or the proud generation. And it kind of discusses the development of the community from 1948 onward. And for today, I want to take a snippet from their own study to talk about the first generation of Palestinian citizens of Israel, which historians have now come to call the quiet generation, or they have come to call that period or era the survival era or the survival period. So basically, the story of this community it basically starts from the year 1948. And from 1948 until 1966, Palestinian citizens of Israel lived under what has become known as the military rule regime, where the vast majority of Arab towns, not all of them, but the majority of them, between 1948 and 1966, lived under basically full military rule, where there was curfew, people were not allowed to leave their homes after a certain hour, people were not allowed to leave their towns without a special permit. There were people who actually for 19 years were not able to leave their small villages, basically, because they lived under military rule. Every week, the military authorities, the establishment would come into each Arab town to meet with the elders, to count the number of people. The upper two pictures here on this slide are from the military rule era. We're basically talking about an era in which the Palestinian community in Israel, even though they were Israeli citizens, they lived de facto under a coercive regime or even an occupational regime, since they had no freedoms, beginning with freedom of movement. But it wasn't only the military rule that makes us remember this generation as a quiet generation, or as a generation that kept its head low, basically, and did not confront the state. There are many reasons for that. First and foremost, there was no middle class following the Nakba. 1948 happens. The first people to flee or to be ethnically cleansed were the middle classes, were the upper classes. We actually have something like that going on in Gaza today, where the middle classes and the upper classes of Gaza were the first to leave after October 7th, mainly in Egypt, because many of them have that economic luxury to do so. But that's also a problem, because you no longer have a middle class, you no longer have that intelligentsia to lead the community. And that's what happened to the Palestinians in Israel. The literacy rates were close to 90%. Almost all women and the vast majority of men were illiterate at the time. And everybody worked in the agrarian sector. We're talking about an agrarian community, like most developing societies at the time who were under colonialism. People lived off of the land. Up until the late 1970s, roughly 3/4 of people from my community lived off of the land. And they also lived during the military rule era and during the survival period under a political patronage system. Israel was really a de facto one-state country from 1948 all up until the 1973 war, really. And it was within this de facto one-state regime where there was a patronage system. Arabs would be given small breadcrumbs in return for support for the ruling class, which was the Mapam party, led by Ben-Gurion's party. They would win 70 and 80% of the Arab vote. Why? Because of all of these facts that I have just listed to you. So in a nutshell, that is the survival period, or the quiet generation. It's also worth noting that since this is a generation, this is the last generation to live in Palestine, or in British Palestine, they did not speak Hebrew. If anybody spoke a second language, it would be English. So they did not understand the new overlords of the land. They did not know their language, their culture, their traditions. And it was because of that that they became known as the silent generation, the generation that kept its head low and did not confront the injustices that it had faced. But then comes 1967, and things slowly but surely start to change. So the 1967 war completely reshaped the Middle East, but more importantly, it also reshaped the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Because Palestinian citizens of Israel reunited with their brethren after 19 years of disconnect. So the West Bank was part of Jordan, Gaza was part of Egypt from 1948 to 1967. All of a sudden, in June 1967, the West Bank and Gaza joined Israel, obviously not as citizens, but they become de facto under Israeli rule, and that allowed Palestinian citizens of Israel to interconnect with people. There are so many stories I heard from elder generations about how, beginning with my own grandmother, whose entire family was in the Gaza Strip, and how she finally met her sisters 19 years after she was unable to see them or contact them. This is an era way before social media, as you all know. But there were also other things that this connection led to, greater levels of intermarriage, obviously. Palestinian citizens in Israel started studying in Palestinian academic institutions in the West Bank. Religious studies in Hebron, for example, people studying at the University of Bethlehem. These things eventually tend to create an identity, or at least reinforce an identity that during the quiet generation, people were scared to express. Most importantly, though, the occupation forced Israeli institutions to focus on the new challenges that stem from becoming an occupying power in the West Bank and Gaza. They started to leave the Palestinian citizens alone, who started to gain more political freedom simply because the security establishment in Israel could no longer discriminate against them in the same ways that it did beforehand. So that's the post-1967 reality. I want to, run through the 1970s all the way up until the 2000s, and I'd be more than simply because of time restrictions. And if you'd like me to come back to this during the Q&A, I would be more than happy to. So the 1970s really is the beginning of political activism, Palestinian political activism in Israel. The first generation, as we said, was silent. The second generation wasn't silent as much. And really, the second generation is really the first generation of Palestinian citizens of Israel, because unlike their parents, they actually grew up in Israel. They grew up in the education system in Israel. They studied Hebrew. They went to Israeli universities. And most importantly, they understood the Israeli way of thinking and mentality. And therefore, they could counter the Israeli arguments in a manner that Israelis could understand. Israelis had a communication problem with the silent generation. By the 1970s, they started to understand this new upcoming elite, because this new upcoming elite understood Israel, understood the language, the culture, etc. And one of the main themes of the 1970s was that this new Arab political elite started creating institutions. What is the first thing you do? You start to create institutions. So the head of local councils, or the Arab Mayors Association, the Arab Students Association, which played a very important role in the political activism of the 1970s. The Committee to Combat Land Confiscation, the Committee for Farmers. I just mentioned that the vast majority of the community up until the late 1970s were peasants, basically. All these institutions started to pop up in the Palestinian community. And then we get to 1976, which is Land Day, which is the first violent confrontation between the state of Israel and the Palestinian community in Israel. I teach Americans political science, American students political science. So one example, when I always talk about Land Day, I always tell them this is our own version of our own Boston Tea Party. You guys are British, so you know what the Boston Tea Party is. And when I explain it to them that way, they kind of understand why it's such a big deal, because this was the first time the community basically moved from this passive way of thinking and dealing with the state of Israel to more confrontational politics and more grassroots politics, not only elites deciding on our behalf. And so Land Day led to this strengthening tide of Palestinianization, or stronger emphasis on Palestinian identity. By the 1980s, the remnants of the military rule were gone, and the security state that was established in Israel, or the police state that was established against the Palestinian Israelis, by the late 1980s came to an end. So, for example, up until the late 1980s, you cannot become a civil servant or work in the public sector. You could not become a teacher if the police or the Shabak, which is the MI5 of Israel, basically blacklists you. I have a case in my own family. My own father, for example, was not allowed to become a school teacher because he was a communist activist. So these kinds of things went on up until the 1980s, basically. And by the 1980s, it stopped, and Palestinians were able to assert their Palestinianism, so to speak, more freely. And Palestinian parties started to pop up. So we had the Communist Party, but we also started to have communist parties. If in the 1950s and 60s, the vast majority of the community voted for Ben-Gurion and his party, by the 1980s and all the way up until today, over 80% of the community vote either for Palestinian parties or the Communist Party in Israel. And so that's from the 1970s to 2000s. Now let's do a quicker one from 2000 all the way up until October 7th, 2023. The last generation can be divided into two main periods, in my opinion. The first one is the crisis period, which began after the failure of the peace process in the 1990s, the failure of Oslo, the Second Intifada. The failure of the Second Intifada basically led to violent riots in Israel between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Israeli authorities. 13 Palestinian citizens of Israel were killed by police authorities. Not even one police officer spent time in jail for that. Not surprising. But more importantly, state institutions downgraded their presence and services in the community as a result. So policing, infrastructure, all these things that governments are responsible to provide their citizens with. Clearly, after the year 2000, we started to see the state move away from her responsibilities. Some of it has to do with this neoliberal economic turn that Israel took, but a lot of it also has to do simply with discrimination and the wounds caused after the failure of the peace process. And we also started to see political persecution of Palestinian parties and legislators. Ever since the 2003 Knesset election and up until today, every single Knesset election, there's an attempt by the election committee to disqualify at least one Arab party, one Palestinian party, or one Palestinian member of the Knesset, at least one, and sometimes it's more than one. Usually it succeeds, but then the High Court overturns the decision of the election committee. And now there's actually a bill, as we speak, there's a bill to try and overrule the High Court, which would basically prevent Palestinians from running in Israeli elections. In the year 2006, Palestinian intellectuals tried to rectify the situation by producing vision documents in which they basically tell the state of Israel or Jewish elites, hey, this is the way we think things should be dealt with. The Arab-Jewish relations should be dealt in a different way than the way the state of Israel has been dealing with them, which is basically prioritizing the Jewish population. No, we're asking for full equality. You want us to become full and loyal citizens of the state of Israel? Okay, you have to become loyal to us as well and provide us with full equality. That's what the vision papers were about, and I'd be happy to expand on them in the Q&A. But also there's, from 2015 and onward, there's the resurgence period, what I call the resurgence period. And it's really highlighted by two things. First of all, the Arab parties united into one big electoral list called the Joint List. And overnight, they moved from political irrelevancy in Israeli politics to basically becoming the kingmakers of Israeli politics. And the second one is basically this rise of an Arab middle class that has been going on for the last 2 decades, decades and a half. Higher education rates in the Arab community, particularly female education rates. Today, we have more educated women than we have educated men. The number of women in the workforce has increased. Just a small example, in the year 1999, employment rate of women was around 10%. Today, we are closer to 40%. And if it wasn't for COVID, we would be even higher. So in the last generation, it multiplied 400% female employment rate. And that also helps you create a middle class. And that's one of the reasons for the resurgence. Now, very quickly, I'm just going to go through over 2 more slides because I know that these are salient issues that many people have been talking about. So in June 2021, we really witnessed something shocking. Even someone like me who's doing a PhD on these kind of things did not see this happening at the time. And that is that a Palestinian party in June 2021, a Palestinian party joined an Israeli government for the first time. Since 1948, there has never been an Arab party in the Israeli government. It's considered treacherous by both communities. Zionists consider it treacherous to allow a Palestinian party to join the government. They're not allowed to take part usually in governments. And from a Palestinian perspective, there's this consensus amongst the political elite that we do not join coalition governments so long there's an occupation. First, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict needs to be solved, and only then can we normalize the state of Israel and her institutions. For the meantime, we're just going to be members of the opposition and just be these anti-establishment politicians, so to speak. That's how Palestinian politics in Israel has been done over the last 40 years. Now, the Ram party came in 2021 and said, no, we want to do things differently. And they shocked everyone by joining a coalition government. So why did they do it? First of all, because the vast majority of the Arab population, the Palestinian population in Israel, support such a move. Data shows, including my own data from my PhD dissertation, for me it was 67%. Other pollsters found it 70%. It's same number more or less, but the vast majority, almost 3/4 of the community, 2/3 to 3/4 support joining a coalition government. The vast majority support joining a coalition government because they understand how Israeli politics works, or the Israeli political culture. You are unable to receive state resources or budgets in Israel if you are not a member of the coalition. Israel is simply a multi-tribal society, and each tribe sends its own representatives to the government. And it is the responsibility of the leaders of the tribe to bring in the resources to their own tribe, so to speak. It's not like the Westminster system where you'd expect Labor or the Tories to kind of represent the entire population. In Israel, it's a bit different. Each community has its own representatives, and if your representatives are members of the opposition, you're not going to be getting a lot of benefits and resources. So that's why many people want to join the government. And there's also this belief, and this was true before October 7th and after October 7th, it was reinforced, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not going to be solved soon. So this whole argument that why are we preventing ourselves from receiving more material benefits, but even though the reason we're doing it, it's not going to be solved anytime soon. And if the Palestinian Authority and if Abu Mazen is willing to cooperate with the Israeli government, why on earth should we not be cooperating with the Israeli government as well for our own benefits? And that is an argument that that resonates with many Palestinian citizens of Israel. Another reason why this happened is that there was a serious political divide in the Jewish community, and which still exists today, especially over Netanyahu. As some of you may know, our prime minister is indicted on a number of corruption cases. That has led many political parties, especially centrist and leftist Jewish political parties, to say that we are unwilling to cooperate with this person who's not even supposed to be. He's finding loopholes that allow him to remain in power, and so Jewish parties to the center and left were not willing to cooperate with Netanyahu, and that opened the door for the Ra'am party. They said, okay, if Jews are unable to, reach a consensus amongst them, we're willing to work with any Jewish party that's willing to work with us. We don't care. You're the right wing, you're the left wing in Israel. We don't care. If you're willing to work with us and give us budgets and all the other material benefits we're asking for, we're willing to cooperate with you. It was a roll of a dice. It was a bet, and it worked perfectly for Ra'am because they found in the Jewish community, they found partners who are willing to work with them in the hopes of preventing the other Jewish side, whether it's the pro-Netanyahu side or the anti-Netanyahu side, from gaining whatever they wanted. So that's a little bit on Ra'am. Let me just go very quickly on the Gaza war. So obviously we're still in the midst of this genocide, and we're still waiting to see where things are going. Just this morning in the city of Beit Lahia in northern Gaza, there was the final population were ethnically cleansed, basically. But it's important to clarify a few things regarding the Palestinian community in Israel. First of all, compared to other Palestinians, our situation is not bad. We're not really suffering from the war, definitely not in the way Gazans are, and to a lesser extent, West Bankers are. Actually, there were more Palestinian citizens of Israel who were killed from rockets coming from Lebanon than there were from anything happening on the Gaza front. Now, Palestinians in Israel overwhelmingly support their brethren, their right to freedom, the right to resist the occupation. But October 7th was something also that the vast majority of the community simply cannot accept. This indiscriminate killing of people in communities within the 1948 territories is something that many people had a hard time with. And that kind of surprised people. And that led the community to be, especially in the first few months, really quiet about the situation. There weren't mass protests against the war as we were used to, let's say, the 2008 war, the 2014 war, the 2021 war. This time, they remained silent. Why did the Palestinians in Israel remain silent? Well, mainly out of fear. In my own dissertation, as you can see, table 14 here, I asked this question to the community, and 71% of the respondents said that they remained quiet because they feared the state's response.
Hello, me again. Sorry, just wanted to say that you're not sharing the screen, your slideshow anymore.
Okay, what slide are you seeing right now?
Not seeing a slide, just seeing you.
Ooh, okay, that's weird. Let me try
In the
again.
meantime, let me just remind everyone to pop any questions you have when we do the Q&A in a moment. Pop any questions you have in the chat box.
How many minutes do I have?
Apparently other people can see the slides, so it's just me. All right, carry on.
I hope you can see the slides
Yes,
now.
I can see it now too. Okay, fantastic.
Perfect.
Hopefully that means we can all see it. Carry.
So 71% of Palestinian citizens of Israel told me that, or told the pollster that they did not, express themselves out of fear. There was this genuine fear because we are not used to Israel being attacked the way it was attacked, and its response was very emotional. The Israeli response was very emotional. That we knew that if we provoked the response, we would get the same treatment Gazans and West Bankers receive. The only difference is that we don't have anybody to protect us. I mean, Gazans might have their own resistance. The West Bank might have, the Palestinian Authority and international recognition. We have nobody to protect us. And the chief of police made it very clear that if he sees any protests, this was in the first 2 weeks of the war, he will personally throw those people on buses and send them to Gaza. Imagine the head of, I don't know, the police chief of Great Britain speaking that way about a community in Great Britain. Our Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, on October the 10th, 2023, said that there was a fear, and he used his position as someone who has intelligence information. He said there's a fear that the Arabs in Israel are preparing riots, another episode of riots against us, the way they did in 2021. The Shabbat came out later and said that that's not true. We have no information as such. It's just that our Minister of National Security is trying to incite violence and pogroms, internal violence between Arabs and Jews in Israel. This is just 3 days after October the 7th. And the community is aware of that, and they did not want to, and people were smart enough to understand what the consequences is if they fell for Ben-Gvir's trap or for the police chief's trap at the time. So the community remained very quiet for the first few months. I'd say we really started to see a change in March. In April, people started to express themselves more freely. People are also worried that this war will shrink in the democratic margins of Israel even more, which have been shrinking for the last 15 years. And people are very worried that if Israel, especially the right-wing government in Israel, is successful in Gaza, it will move its attention toward the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. That if we see ethnic cleansing or mass war crimes that are normalized by the international community in Gaza, it really is just a matter of time until we see these kind of war crimes take place in the West Bank or inside Israel proper. Now, a little bit about the contemporary challenges that are facing my community. First of all, crime and violence. This is a very, very big issue. If the Palestinians in Israel were an independent country, we would be the 4th or 5th country in the world when it comes to levels of crime and violence. We are really there with countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, Venezuela. These are the countries that, if we were a country, these are the countries that we would be in the same league with when it comes to crime and violence. We have a big, and this is partially due to the state's responsibility. Just to give you a small example, the murder resolving rates are less than 10%. Meaning, if you commit a murder in our community, there's over a 90% chance that you will walk away from it. Nobody will ever catch you. There's lack of policing in our community. And now we have a Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's actually encouraging these kinds of things. He's actually enjoying the fact that under his watch, we have the highest murder rates in Israel's history in the Arab community. So this is a big problem that it could only get worse over time. We have a very big land and housing problem. We are 21% of the population, including East Jerusalem, if you include East Jerusalem, but we only own 3% of the land. There are actually loopholes in the Israeli system that prevent Arabs from acquiring state-owned land in Israel. Actually, Israel's land policy is similar to countries like North Korea or China, where the vast majority of land is owned by the state, but there are loopholes that allow the state only to sell it, basically, to Jewish organizations. Ever since the creation of the State of Israel, there have been over 700 Jewish towns that were created versus 0 Palestinian towns that were created. Jews have different methods of housing in Israel. You can live in a town, you can live in an urban area, you can live in a kibbutz, in a moshav, in an individual farm. And for Palestinians, you're going to be born in the same town that your parents were born in and your grandparents before them were born in. And that town just so happens to be about maybe 50 to 60% of its private land was confiscated in the past, and that land was given to Jewish communities. So land and housing is a very, very big issue. Obviously, with the rise of this new political elite, this far-right political elite in Israel, there's rising levels of incitement, and there are laws aiming to limit the political representation of Palestinian citizens. In the last 2 weeks, there was a law that is trying to prevent local council members in Arab towns from running for elections if they express solidarity with the Palestinians. There's the same kind of law regarding Arab members of Knesset from years back. So there are these attempts to omit or to prevent authentic representation of the Palestinian community. And my final slide for today is the kind of future challenges. So I just talked about contemporary challenges, but it's also when we think about this community, it's worth thinking about some of the things we'll be dealing with 10, 15, and 20 years now. So first of all, to continue the last point is attacks against the political representation of the community. I expect that there will be attacks against our democratically elected leadership for the foreseeable future, maybe even full disqualification of the entire leadership. That is an extreme case, but it is possible. Same with discrimination to intensify in the years to come. Another issue for people also at the Balfour Project to think about is the one-state reality we live in. I mean, we can talk about partition all we want. We can talk about 2 states for 2 people all we want. But the simple fact is that from the river to the sea, there is one political entity, and that one political entity is Israel. It might allow limited freedoms to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. It might allow limited autonomy here and there for some minorities, but from the river to the sea, there really is one regime, and that is Israel. And the place of the Palestinian citizens of Israel within a one-state reality will change. Their political freedoms, and even more than political freedoms maybe, will be limited even more and more. And I just wanted to end and want to go back to that identity crisis point, just to make one point about this. There's this dichotomous force that's pushing Palestinian citizens of Israel at the same time towards their Palestinian identity, but also towards their Israeli identity. On the one hand, there's greater economic integration, especially that the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel does not partake in the Israeli economy that much. For religious reasons, and so Israel is counting on the Palestinian citizens to take a bigger role in the economy. There have been employment schemes. There have been economic investments in my community. Even the Netanyahu governments have invested heavily in my community over the last 10 years because they want Arabs to integrate economically into the system, because Israel really cannot hold on to its status as an industrialized and developed economy without its Arabs taking a bigger role in the fabric of the country moving forward. And if they are going to play a bigger role, then it's only a matter of time till they will have a bigger say in decision making and policy making. So, I mean, I'm trying to be a little bit positive here because this is a story that unfortunately never had a good beginning to begin with. We always knew it wouldn't have a good ending, and with October 7th, now we obviously know how it all ends. So at least I'm trying to give you guys a little bit of hope to hold on to. And with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and we've had so many amazing questions and comments coming in. I'm going to try to get through as many of them as possible. It's really nice to be able to cover this issue that is quite often ignored or sidelined because of the more seemingly urgent humanitarian issues in Gaza and so forth, but it's such an important issue. I had worked in the past with an organization called the Galilee Foundation, which works specifically with Palestinian students, citizens of Israel, going to Israeli universities. And it was really interesting because they had said repeatedly that they were jealous of their peers who were at universities in the West Bank and Gaza because at least they were surrounded by other Palestinians mainly, and they weren't treated as pariahs at their own universities. They were reporting that even if they got together, too many of them to have lunch together, they would be broken up by security because it was seen as a threat that these Palestinian students were forming a group. And it's just heartbreaking when you think what university should be about. And I was fascinated to hear about your studies on national identity because that's what I did at university as well. But with regards to Palestinian citizens in London, in England, what did they identify first as? Arab, Palestinian, British, European? There, a lot of them were half-halves like I am. Was it the other nationality that they might have? So just really interesting. And we look forward to hearing much more from you. So do please keep in touch so that we can continue sharing your publications and whatnot with our audience, because I think you've got a lot of new fans as well. We've got the first question is from Akram. She says, thank you so much for an eloquent talk. Recently, there have been a few initiatives jointly between Palestinians and Israelis. What are your views on these initiatives? Which of these initiatives is to the best interest of both? We've got a Land for All or the Middle East Alliance. Do you have any comments on those?
I'm a big fan of a Land for All. I think that if we are ever going to reach a compromise or a solution to this conflict, it's going to be along the borders of Land for All. So Land for All is this joint Israeli-Palestinian organization that believes that the only solution to the conflict is two states, but two states basically with open borders, where there's full integration and freedom of movement between both communities. This whole notion of, again, trying to disconnect the geographic entity from the river to the sea, it hasn't worked. Both communities are connected to this geographic entity from the river to the sea, and any attempt to try to limit any of these two communities is going to fail. So I'm a big fan of Land for All. Obviously, there's other initiatives. You mentioned All MEP, others. I'm all for them. I just know for a fact that they don't really work. Not that they, let me rephrase that. They are important in the sense that they can help with creating a young political elite who are committed to these values, and that is important. But these kinds of events don't usually get into the nitty-gritty things, but the issues that really are at the heart of the tension. And that's what Land for All kind of does, that they kind of try to dive into the issues that, okay, we're really divided over, and how do we find a solution to these issues? Other institutions won't, but I do kind of support more grassroots initiatives, joint Israeli-Palestinian grassroots initiatives. So Standing Together, if you've heard of Standing Together, I'm also a fan of theirs, even though I know the last year, especially with the war, there was some criticism that I agree with put up against them. It took them about 3 to 4 weeks to put out a statement against the war. That was very disappointing. But other than that, they do some pretty good things. So I'm for it. I call on people not to put all their money on it in that sense. A Land for All is something different. I think that is actually the future, and that is something I would encourage more people to study more about and get more educated about. They might agree with it, they might disagree with it, but that's it.
Fantastic, thank you. I don't know whether you covered this in your studies or whether you want to talk about it, but it's a really interesting question regardless. I've got from Levette Calendar, how do the Israeli Palestinians view BDS?
Interesting question. So overall, very sympathetic, obviously, although you do pay a price for it sometimes. And that's when I talk about identity crises, this is actually BDS is actually a very good example. On the one hand, you want this international pressure on Israel. You want it also for yourself because you're discriminated against as an Israeli citizen, right? but this is also international pressure that you yourself would pay the price for. But that's, again, something that I'm willing to do it. I think with BDS in particular, there are some, if I was on their advisory board, I tell them to focus on some issues differently. I think they put themselves into unwarranted situations. For example, they're not fans of standing together, which I understand, but putting up on prior campaign against standing together is kind of, you're not keeping your eye on the ball, so to speak. So, I mean, some criticisms here and there, but overall, I'm very supportive. As someone who does not believe in violence, I think that, and as someone who believes in the moral argument that we have here, I do believe that nonviolent resistance based on a moral argument is something that we should adopt, but we also need to be more politically savvy when we do it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm going to collate a few questions because we've had quite a lot on this topic, but we've had questions from Vincent Van Ulzen, Patricia Rogers, Paul Winter about this theme. In what ways are the rights of Palestinian Israelis currently different from those of Jewish Israelis? What are the different discriminatory policies that are in place? How close is this situation to apartheid?
So Palestinian citizens in Israel are discriminated against in all walks of life. It begins with how state institutions treat you, to how the public sphere treats you, to how the political elite and the media elite treat you in every way. But just to give you a little bit of data or a little bit of numbers. So I began with the housing issue, right? That ever since 1948, over 700 Jewish towns were created versus 0 Arab towns that were created. Roughly 60% of private Arab land has been confiscated in Israel since 1948. Almost 0% of Jewish land has been confiscated. Now, when the numbers are that big, you pretty much know why that is. But also when we come into allocation of budgets, for example, whether it's for local councils, even though Arabs are at the lower scale of the socioeconomic ladder in Israel, therefore they should receive greater benefits from the state, and local councils on average receive less than Jewish local councils. Arab schools and Arab students on average. So the state of Israel invests, and don't catch me exactly on the number, I saw this about 3 or 4 weeks ago. The state of Israel invests on average nearly $25,000 per Jewish student, while for Arab students it's about $10,000. All you need to do is just drive by a highway in Israel, look at a Jewish town from the outside versus a Palestinian town from the outside, and you can, just from the infrastructure, the crumbling infrastructure, you'll see where the state invests and where it does not invest. And then we get into this whole issue of incitement. By the way, I mentioned about land confiscation, housing. We don't even have one hospital, public hospital, in the entire Palestinian community in Israel. There have been attempts to build a public hospital that would serve Palestinians and Jews. Actually, a few years back, there was talk about building a hospital in the town of Sakhnin in northern Israel. Now, Sakhnin is a town that there are many Arab communities around it, but there's also a few Jewish communities around it as well. They also would gain from having a hospital there. But at the end of the day, the Israeli government decided to build a hospital in a Jewish area that would serve mainly the Jewish population. So while on paper, there is full equality, in practice, there is almost no equality at all. You asked about apartheid. So this is, I always say that Israel has multiple regimes. Between the river and the sea, there are multiple regimes. There's a regime in Israel proper. I would not call it apartheid. I would call it a regime of statutory discrimination, meaning it goes further than institutional discrimination. Statutory discrimination goes further than institutional. It's discrimination on purpose. It's not just that, state institutions have got used to dealing this way. No, it's part of the raison d'etre, so to speak, of the state of Israel to discriminate against her Palestinian population. I think in East Jerusalem is the clearest form of apartheid in Israel, because you have one city, Jerusalem, where there's one municipal borders, but within that municipal borders, one group, the Jewish population, have citizenship. The non-Jewish population does not have citizenship and doesn't really have access to citizenship. Israel says, oh, if East Jerusalemites want citizenship, all they have to do is just apply. That's not true. Over 95% do not receive citizenship. And then obviously you have the West Bank, and then you have Gaza, which is even worse than, right? So, so when it comes to Palestinians in Israel, I don't think it's true to call it apartheid, but it's not that the situation is really not much better.
Thanks for that. It's so eloquent, and it's really useful to have this all laid out clearly. This is a really depressing question from Leslie Vench. In the USA, I'm afraid of what our incoming government will mean for Palestinians. Can you see a positive possibility here? Will there be any good news?
Good news, no. I mean, my wishful thinking is based on two things. First, that Trump doesn't like Netanyahu personally. We know that. Actually, the guy who, the journalist who was able to get that out of Trump used the F word with Netanyahu famously a few years back. The journalist who got that out of Trump, Barak Ravid, is a semi-colleague of mine. He comes to the same office that I go to at the university. So I talked to him twice about it, and he tells me Trump really, really doesn't like me. So that's something that I'm kind of hoping maybe, but there isn't much to build on. And then of course, if Trump and the Arab Gulf states might try to work something out, I don't know. But no, if you're a Palestinian, these are going to be 4 very hard years. But as we learned the last 13 months with Biden, it wasn't better under Biden either. So no. I understand Palestinian. I don't have a right to vote, but I definitely understand Palestinians who decided not to vote this time for the Democrats.
It's terrifying how unpredictable Trump can be and how that might play out. Johnny Byrne asks, given the level of discrimination, and as you described, how high the discrimination goes up in the regime or regimes, can Israel truly be described as democratic?
So that's a good question, and it's one of those questions that, you know, we have clarified, for me at least, it's been clarified very, very long ago. Israel truly is, and I speak now as a political scientist, Israel truly is an anomaly in the world, in the way it functions, because it definitely does have characteristics of a democratic state, but at the same time, it has characteristics not only of an authoritarian state, but of a coercive authoritarian state. And they somehow kind of coexist until the inevitable explosion will come. I'll put it, I like the way, there's a very famous Palestinian member of Knesset, his name is Ahmad Tibi. He said it perfectly. He said, Israel is a democratic state for her Jewish population, but she's a Jewish state for her Palestinian population. And I largely agree with that, you know, democracy or the rules of democracy largely exist in the Jewish community, or Jewish citizens do definitely live in a democracy, albeit a flawed democracy that is shrinking over time. Palestinians do not live in a democracy. They live in a system that has some pluralism, political pluralism, especially if you compare it to other Middle Eastern countries. But as somebody who does live in a liberal democracy now in the United States, I can clearly tell the difference between a true liberal democracy and the state of Israel. So I wouldn't call it a true democracy for Arab citizens.
No. Another really interesting question from Debanjan Banerjee. How long do you think Israeli democracy will survive in its present form?
Well, I think 48 hours ago, Netanyahu just tried to fire the last gatekeepers who could prevent him, who could basically kick him out of office. He's also trying, well, now he has to testify in his corruption cases. He tried to get the Israeli Shabak, the Israeli FBI or MI5 basically to give him a special permission because of the war, that he doesn't have to testify. When they told him we can't really give you that, he went to the military and told them, hey, you have to give me that. You have to tell basically the authorities I can't testify right now because I'm dealing with the war. So what I'm trying to get to is that Israeli democracy has been shrinking already over the last 2 years, especially with the judicial overhaul. There is an attempt to morph Israel into this regime that kind of looks like Turkey or Hungary. where there's this dominant figure in the prime minister who has been in power for 18 years now, 15 years in a row, 18 years in total, and he's trying to create the country in his own vision. So again, I would say that while Israel definitely does have some kind of pluralism that still exists, political pluralism, just like Hungary does and Turkey to a lesser extent does, I do agree. I think calling Israel simply a democracy, not a democracy, but is very problematic. So I would agree with that.
Thank you. So we're going to run over a little bit, but it's just because it's just fascinating, and
Sure.
really appreciate the opportunity to pick your brains on all of this. I just wanted to say to our attendees, thank you so much. I can tell by the questions that have come in that we've got loads of new people that have come along to this webinar that we haven't had at any of our webinars before. So thank you and welcome. We hold these webinars for free. Like I said, on average, about twice a month. We cover a whole range of topics because the idea is to get different hooks for people. So if you're interested in the arts or history or politics or whatever, that hopefully we've got webinars that cover that field of interest, all on the issue of Israel-Palestine. But we would really appreciate support. So I'm going to pop a link or two in the chat box. One, to make donations. If you have the ability to support us financially, we would be really, really grateful. And also the link to support us by giving regularly, by setting up a regular donation. That makes you, entitles you to become a friend with the capital F of the Balfour Project, which means that you get discounted or free tickets to our paid events like film screenings, our annual conference, which will be on the 8th of May. Pop that into your, pencil that into the diary. That's our annual conference will be in London, 8th of May. We're still working on the issues, more info to follow. But yes, discounted and free tickets to a bunch of our different events, as well as quarterly meetings with key people in the Balfour Project so that you can get feedback, behind the scenes information, as well as give your ideas, impressions, and so forth about our work and activities. So please do consider that. It really helps us with cutting down admin costs and planning for our future. So that was me with my little cap out. I always try to pick a question that will hopefully mean, I think you did this with your presentation, that to end on a hopeful note so that, we don't all just end this webinar feeling depressed. Hopefully this will lead to a positive note. This is from Andreas Katsaras. So our final question of the evening: what needs to happen for Palestinians in Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank to start speaking with one voice?
Ooh, very good question. A much better political elite. Let's begin with that. There's a need, and I would connect this to the one-state reality where I said we live in a de facto one-state reality, and that's going to be a reality for the foreseeable future. There is a need for the leadership of these communities. I would also add the East Jerusalem Palestinians as well, because they are a community within their own right. The leadership of these four communities need to come together, and they need to present a vision going forward. Where do we see ourselves? How do we see our relationship with the Jewish community in our homeland? Jews are not going to go anywhere. We're not going to go anywhere. It's time we have a serious conversation about this. I already told you my opinion. I'm in the lines of Land for All. I'm a very big fan of what they're proposing. But to answer the question, I think what we need is our political leadership to come together to present a vision, first of all, for the people, for the future, but also for the Jewish community. This is how we see the future. And this is actually something that I personally have been thinking about a lot lately. And who knows, if I don't see anybody who take the lead on that, I might just do it myself. There you go. I hope that's positive, at least.
Yeah. I like the idea of you putting forward something, so I think you get a lot of support.
Have to.
Yes, please. Please. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for speaking to us. I think I can tell by the comments coming in that we've really appreciated hearing you speak about this. I'm really sorry as well for all the questions that we didn't manage to get through. There was just so many, and they were amazing, weren't they? They were so insightful. So I want to thank you for coming and speaking to us. I want to thank everyone who's come along to listen to this webinar today. I'll be putting the recording up on the website, hopefully by tonight, and I will send an email out to the mailing list once that is up. So if you think of anyone that you think will be interested to hear this or should hear this webinar, then please do share it with them. It will go out on YouTube, on our website, as well as a podcast which will be on all of the places that you listen to your podcasts to, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, et cetera, et cetera. We've had a request for your presentation. Is it okay to share that?
Sure, sure. And you can also, if anyone has specific questions, you can give them my email. I'll be happy to communicate.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, that's absolutely brilliant. So thank you again, and I hope everyone has a lovely rest of their day. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye.